So what is the American Navy up to again? The Pentagon has approved the Trump-class nuclear battleships, which will be the most powerful vessels in the American Navy, and in addition, the future aircraft carrier Doris Miller will be delayed by 2 years. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at what the American Navy looks like right now and where it's headed. Because considering what's happening in Iran and in the Strait of Hormuz and what happened in China, where in some ways Trump was a bit servile towards the Chinese and was rather cautious regarding their rivalry over Taiwan, I think it's quite important to take a look at the state of the American Navy, which plays a huge role in both of these cases. So if you want to know more, keep watching. We discussed this quite thoroughly here on the stream with the chat and went through some materials, so I think it could be interesting. First, we'll look at some issues concerning the U.S. Navy, and we'll discuss the Trump class at the very end. So, the future aircraft carrier Doris Miller will be delayed by 2 years. Right now, there are some problems with the construction. Doris Miller is basically a Ford-class aircraft carrier. Right now, the Americans have only one Ford-class aircraft carrier, and it was actually the biggest, most modern, most powerful ship with the largest displacement, which was also deployed in Iran and had to withdraw because their laundry room caught fire and their toilets were clogged. However, besides that, the Americans are building 3 more ships of the same type, the JFK, that is the Kennedy, the Doris Miller, and also the USS Enterprise. Yes, the Enterprise is coming back. What a triumph. However, they are experiencing delays. The Doris Miller will be delayed by 2 years. The Enterprise also has some delays. The JFK was also delayed. And overall completion of the aircraft carrier fleet is facing growing delays because the construction of one ship delays the construction of the next. And the second ship delays the construction of the third ship, and overall it's being delayed even more because there are some works going on in the shipyards where they're being built, which complicates things. It's being slowed down, it's getting complicated, and with projects as big as aircraft carriers, delays are quite common, but 2 years is something that could be considered a pretty long delay. Here we could say that it will be completed in the year 2000. The entire fleet of aircraft carriers should be finished in 2034 at this point. Originally, the complete fleet was supposed to be finished in 2032. And that tells us that China, the biggest naval rival of the United States, has 2 extra years to arm itself, prepare, and improve its navy, which it is arming and preparing really very quickly. It really has a large displacement. At this point, the ships of the Chinese Navy together have a greater displacement than the ships of the American Navy. However, the difference is that the Chinese Navy is still mainly green water, meaning it's more capable of operating in coastal waters rather than a blue water navy, meaning able to operate on the open ocean. That's important to mention. They basically aren't building a large number of smaller ships for China. The Americans are currently focusing on building a smaller number of large ships, as you can see here with the aircraft carriers, or as you'll be able to see here with the battleships, which are supposed to have a displacement of up to 35,000 tons. Just for comparison, the cruiser Moskva had about 10,000 tons, but back to the aircraft carriers. So this delay means that the Chinese have 2 extra years to devote to building up their navy, and they have 2 extra years to possibly take whatever naval action they might need, because once the U.S. Navy fully re-equips with new fighter jets, new ships, and new aircraft carriers, they will again have a massive technological and power advantage over China, and at that point, China won't have any chance to compete with the U.S. Navy. Until those ships are finished, China could theoretically pick up the pace, build more aircraft carriers, arm more naval forces, and do something about the American influence in the Pacific Ocean. At this moment, theoretically, it would be possible. Once the aircraft carriers are completed, combined with all the other plans of the American Navy, it will be more or less a suicidal action. If, of course, the Americans want to resist China. Otherwise, regarding the next plan, the American Navy plans to build dozens and dozens of ships, including new ships. At this moment, what the Americans lack the most are frigates and destroyers, but above all, they lack frigates, that is, ships of medium displacement, medium size, and medium strength. They have huge ships, and then they have small ships, but they don't have anything in between, and besides that, they want to deepen this gap even more. They want to expand the presence of unmanned systems and unmanned ships and submarines, you could say, simply platforms for drones, for example, and so on and so forth. And they want to build more than 60 of those. So that's actually old news from 2022, but then we have more recent reports that they're building destroyers as of 2026 and that they want to build more ships, which are specifically related to remote-controlled unmanned operations and so on and so forth. So now let's talk about the buildup of the U.S. Navy. They are fully aware that the construction is not going as it should. At this moment, the U.S. Navy has 291 combat ships. And according to the law, they should have 355. The construction is going very slowly, it's very expensive, and the costs keep rising. What is the reason for that? It's because the plans for those ships keep expanding, and expanding. And at that moment, whenever you say, hey, it would be nice if the ship could do this, and it would be nice if you could mount this on the ship, and it would be nice if it had capacity for lasers, defense and rail guns, and in the future, whatever else comes along. So when it keeps expanding and expanding like this, of course, it gets more expensive. In the end, nothing really gets built. And on top of that, when it's concentrated in just a few shipyards, there isn't really enough workforce either. That's why there's a new approach to shipbuilding now. We'll see if it works, but the idea is that it should function more in a decentralized way, working with the fact that there will be some production blocks here. For example, even the American government, which used to order work from those shipyards and certain manufacturers, now guarantees the wage levels of certain workers, even pays the workers' wages directly so that the money doesn't go to the company, which could misuse it. So the American government said, look, we want to pay the workers' wages directly, so they will be such and such, so you don't lose people, so you have enough staff, so you can deliver. So in this big contract, the government has a certain control over the payroll and just wants to have a say in this. But let's say the company accepted it, they're fine with it, why not? But the point is, they just want to increase the efficiency of construction and, hey, let's go for it, let's go for it. And most likely they'll focus on building destroyers and on building those unmanned things. Of course, they'll continue building those aircraft carriers and then, of course, those unfortunate battleships as well. The real problem here is that they want to focus on building Trump's beautiful battleships, but what they really need are frigates, which they have too few of or are outdated, and overall, the American mid-sized Navy is like that. It's like a weaker little brother of the big, large-scale Navy. Besides that, Americans are also really lacking in minesweepers, which they've now realized in Hormuz and so on. Well, anyway, big boys need big toys and big, and for that reason, but also because they're talking about a new approach to how they'll use the Navy and what they need to be able to do. They're going to build Trump-class battleships. So they call it a battleship. It's hard to say how this battleship will actually be built, but we have reports that it shouldn't have stealth, but at the same time, it should have stealth because it's better, but it shouldn't have stealth because, according to Trump, stealth ships are ugly. Well, we'll see how it ends up being built, but let's say it could have stealth, but at the same time, it will have nuclear propulsion, so that kind of reduces the possibility of stealth. Hard to say. Look, we don't really know the key detailed specifications anyway, so there's no point in talking about it, but we know it's going to be a battleship or a battleship. They will call it a battleship, but it will have a displacement of 35,000 tons, which is more like a huge cruiser than a battleship class ship. On the other hand, there have been battleships in history that had this kind of displacement and cruisers that, on the other hand, exceeded it. We also know that the cruiser Moskva had significantly less. So when it comes to how ship classes are divided, it's pretty messy. Also, in the past, it was called differently, and there was a lot of manipulation with what the actual displacement was because you had some standard that it could have at most, and then it was exceeded and it had a bigger standard, a bigger displacement than was stated. Irrelevant. What matters is that 35,000 tons is just insane. It's simply a huge ship. If we look at how big that is, for example, the Italian flagship aircraft carrier, this lady here, Cavour, or however you pronounce it, Cavour, the Italian flagship aircraft carrier has a displacement of only 27,000 tons, and the aircraft carrier de Gaulle, if I'm not mistaken, is around 30,000 tons. Therefore, the Trump-class battleships should have a greater displacement. They should be bigger than European aircraft carriers. What should they be able to do? Above all, they should have enormous firepower. There should be a combination of the power of rocket artillery and the power of conventional artillery. You might be thinking, what kind of nonsense is this? After World War II, battleships of this size with conventional artillery were phased out because it turned out that aircraft carriers are absolute superweapons and battleships are completely useless compared to them. They definitely buried battleships like Yamato, which got totally wrecked, sank, and that was the end of it. Same with Bismarck, the end of battleships. At that moment, it was the time for aircraft carriers, carrier groups, a larger number of smaller ships, and then the carrier itself, which of course has planes, so it can operate as a carrier for those small weapons platforms. Kind of like a swarm or something like that, if you will. Well, you're right, and you would be right. But the problem is that in recent years, naval gun and missile artillery has improved significantly, and right now there are simply guns and ammunition capable of firing from those cannons very cheaply or relatively cheaply compared to, say, an F-35 sortie. Quite accurately, a very destructive projectile that can hit the enemy very, very precisely at up to 150 kilometers. Yeah, so it's no longer just about 20 or 30 kilometers of gun artillery like it was in World War II. Today, the ability to fire at 150 to 180 kilometers simply gives the ship a different capability, a different kind of usability. And it's worth adding that if the ship can fire such powerful projectiles so accurately at that distance, then of course, in a fight against Iran, for example, such a battleship would be useless. Yeah, because it's still better to have an aircraft carrier accompanied by a task force, since basically you want to be able to fly deep into the country and 150 kilometers when you want to fight a country like Iran, for example, or like Venezuela. Well, 150 kilometers is a lot in the case of Venezuela, but if you want to besiege a country from the sea, from offshore, then an aircraft carrier is still absolutely and clearly the dominant option. But if you wanted to stand up to a country that has a strong surface fleet, then a battleship is something that, given the existence of these new missiles and precision rocket artillery and these things, could significantly můžou vám výrazným způsobem strengthen your fleet, and you can significantly increase your firepower by including this battleship. In the future, you can also simply mount things like laser cannons as anti-aircraft weapons or some railguns or new technologies on a battleship because it has a large carrying capacity. At the same time, you can surround the battleship with some small boats equipped with anti-aircraft weapons, or you can put the anti-aircraft weapons directly on the battleship. So, The large battleship as a platform gives you quite significant destructive capabilities and the ability to fight against another technologically advanced opponent who also has a fairly large surface fleet. You know? So this tells us that the Americans are preparing for a fight against China, and of course they want to keep building their aircraft carriers. They want to maintain air superiority at sea and on the coast, but at the same time they want to have something they can just load up with a bunch of cannons, and when it sails somewhere, it causes an apocalypse and then sails away again. A relatively low cost, because it's really important to say here that bombing something back to the Stone Age on the coast with a battleship is significantly cheaper than bombing it back to the Stone Age with an aircraft carrier. That's the first point. And the second point is that when you have bad weather, the aircraft carrier kind of loses its functionality, or its functionality is limited, while the battleship can keep firing even in bad weather. That's kind of a small advantage. So if we were talking about whether battleships, modern battleships, should replace aircraft carriers, absolutely not. If we were talking about whether those battleships should replace frigates and destroyers, absolutely not. But if we were to talk about whether a battleship is something the United States Navy would use in a situation other than where they would use a carrier group, yes, a battleship is something that in most cases where the United States would need to do something is, well, unusable, or maybe it's overkill, but then there are cases where a battleship can be significantly better. And that's, for example, projecting power against a sophisticated enemy. Or if you just want to mess with something on the coast. So that's how it is. Look, this is the current situation. So the US Navy went in this direction. It will cost a lot of money. It will take a lot of time. Maybe it will turn out to be nonsense, but right now it's not as stupid as it might seem at first glance. Yeah, it's not that stupid. Times have changed. Maybe it's time to admit that battleships, if you have enough money, can have a certain place in your fleet and give you some new abilities and options that you didn't have nearly as much with aircraft carriers, frigates, and destroyers. Whether it's worth it because a battleship is more expensive than an aircraft carrier, whether it's worth it, whether it wouldn't be better to just build 10 frigates instead of one battleship. Now, don't take my word for it. Look, I don't know. In my opinion, yes, but the US Navy says, maybe under the influence of Donald Trump, maybe just to please him, it's hard to say, but the US Navy says that battleships are better, that one battleship is better than 3 frigates or 3 destroyers. That's how it is. Who am I to argue with them, right? So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Please write me your opinion about battleships, frigates, cruisers, the Air Force and Navy of the United States, Donald Trump, the Czech Republic's Navy, and the aircraft carrier Carol Gott. It doesn't matter. Just write something. I'll really appreciate any feedback from you. Follow my work, support my work through the QR codes, because independent journalism is what stands between you and governments going into debt, slow GDP growth, higher taxes, and massive famine and all those things. So, hey, that's a pretty good investment, isn't it? And yeah, join the streams because the show goes on. We're moving forward, or check out more videos on this YouTube channel.